April 28, 1945. Dachau, Germany. Sturmbannführer Eduard Weiter, last commandant of Dachau concentration camp, supervised final evacuation while American artillery sounded increasingly closer. Smoke rose from piles of documents being hastily burned in the administrative courtyard. Weiter had commanded Dachau since October 1943. Succeeding series of commandants who had transformed camp opened in 1933 as detention center for political enemies of the state into something very different. In recent weeks, he had organized forced evacuation marches moving thousands of prisoners toward the Alps. Incriminating records were systematically destroyed. SS guards received instructions about what to say when Americans arrived. Weiter believed evidence would be eliminated in time. Camp would be presented as labor facility for political prisoners, no different from internment camps the Allies themselves operated. Under German law, everything had been legal. Orders came from above. Guards merely fulfilled duty. Weiter articulated confidence shared among SS command. Americans will find labor camp operating under German regulations. Prisoners who died were criminals, and sick treated as law permitted. We followed superior orders. They have no jurisdiction to judge us under their laws. What Weiter and SS guards didn't comprehend was that no preparation, no evidence destruction, no prepared story could hide reality American soldiers were about to discover, and that defense of following orders would crumble before something transcending legal concepts of culpability. On April 29, 1945, soldiers of 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division and 45th Thunderbird Division converged on Dachau without knowing exactly what they would find. Before reaching camp gates, they discovered railway train with approximately 40 cars containing evidence no military training had prepared them to witness. Inside camp, more than 30,000 surviving prisoners awaited liberation in conditions that destroyed any illusion about nature of war they had fought. Discovery forced confrontation not just with enemy, but with limits of humanity itself and fundamental question. When confronted with evidence of systematized evil, do rules of civilization still apply? Dachau proved witnessing certain horrors has limit beyond which professional composure collapses completely. Mathematics of horror was already documented in records SS couldn't destroy completely in time. Dachau was first concentration camp established by Nazi regime, opened March 1933, just weeks after Hitler assumed power as chancellor. Originally designed to detain political opponents, communists, trade unionists, camp became architectural and administrative prototype for an entire system of camps that would spread across occupied Europe. Gates with cynical inscription, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, were copied in multiple camps. Structure of barracks, watchtowers, electrified fences, medical isolation areas became blueprint for suffering of millions. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 180,000 individuals were prisoners at Dachau. Official records documented at least 41,500 deaths, but real number was certainly higher considering destroyed records and undocumented deaths in final months. On April 26, 1945, 3 days before liberation, there were 67,665 registered prisoners at Dachau and its subcamps, more than half in main camp. 43,350 were categorized as political prisoners, 22,100 were Jews. Remainder distributed across various other categories including Roma, Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, men accused under laws criminalizing homosexuality, and Soviet prisoners of war. Typhus epidemic raged through camp due to extreme overcrowding caused by evacuation transports from other camps near collapsing front lines. Catastrophic living conditions accelerated mortality in final months. Of 41,500 who perished during 12 years of camp operation, more than 1/3 died in last 6 months of war when entire system collapsed under weight of its own unsustainable brutality. Dachau also served as training center for SS guards, who would subsequently be sent to other camps throughout occupied Europe. Control techniques, punishment methods, administrative procedures were standardized at Dachau and then replicated at Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, and dozens of other camps. This function as school of systematized cruelty meant Dachau exported not just prisoners, but methodologies of dehumanization to entire camp system. Guards trained at Dachau took established practices to extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, where methods were industrialized on genocidal scale. Discovery of Dachau by American forces would reveal not just one camp, but evidence of educational system of brutality. Starting April 26, SS forced more than 7,000 prisoners, majority Jews, on forced evacuation march toward Tegernsee in south. During these death marches, guards summarily executed anyone unable to continue walking due to exhaustion, hunger, or disease. Bodies were left along roads where they fell. Many died from hypothermia during cold April nights, from dehydration under sun during day, or simply from complete physical collapse after months or years of malnutrition and forced labor. There was no legitimate military objective to these marches. They were exercises in final cruelty before living evidence of crimes could be liberated. American forces would liberate survivors of these marches in early May, finding column after column of human beings reduced to walking skeletons, many dying even after liberation, as physical damage was irreversible. On April 27th, train with approximately 40 cars arrived at Dachau. It had left Buchenwald on April 7th, transporting approximately 5,000 prisoners, but followed tortuous route through Saxony into Czechoslovakia before reaching Dachau 20 days later. During 20 days, prisoners were kept in locked cars designed for cattle transport, without toilets, without adequate ventilation, with minimal rations of water and food that ceased completely in final days. Typhus raged through overcrowded cars. Dehydration killed more quickly than starvation. Some went insane from psychological torment. Of 5,000 who began journey, more than 2,310 had perished when train finally stopped on tracks near Dachau. SS guards simply abandoned train and fled as American artillery approached. This was the train American soldiers would find first, physical evidence that would destroy any remaining concept that Nazis were merely political adversaries in conventional war. Strategic impact transcended numbers. Dachau was discovery that finally answered questions some American soldiers had asked during months of combat across Europe. Why are we really fighting? General Dwight Eisenhower, who had visited smaller camp at Ohrdruf in early April, immediately understood importance of documenting discoveries. Confronted with evidence at Ohrdruf, Eisenhower had been visibly nauseated. General George Patton, man known for strong stomach after decades of military career, had vomited after tour of camp. Eisenhower ordered soldiers not engaged in direct combat be taken to see camps. He requested members of Congress and prominent newspaper editors be transported to witness. Eisenhower would later declare American soldier might not know what he fought for, but after seeing concentration camps knew what he fought against. This moral clarity, however devastating its source, removed any ambiguity about nature of war and necessity of total victory without compromise. On April 29, 1945, 3 American divisions converged simultaneously on Dachau, creating confusion about which unit officially liberated camp first. 42nd Rainbow Infantry Division under command of Major General Harry Collins, 45th Thunderbird Infantry Division commanded by Major General Robert Frederick, and elements of 27th Tank Battalion of 20th Armored Division all participated in liberation. Controversy over precedence would last decades among veterans of both divisions, but United States Army Center of Military History and United States Holocaust Memorial Museum jointly recognize all 3 units as official, liberating units of Dachau. What mattered historically wasn't question of precedence but fact that thousands of American soldiers witnessed same reality simultaneously, eliminating possibility of later denial or relativization. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks commanded 3rd Battalion of 157th Infantry Regiment of 45th Division when received orders to secure camp. Sparks and his men were veterans hardened by combat, had participated in landings in Sicily, Italy, southern France, and months of combat through Germany. They had seen death in multiple forms during campaigns, but nothing in military experience prepared them for what they would find. As they advanced toward Dachau, distinct odor permeated air kilometers before reaching installation. Soldiers initially assumed it was smell of dead animals, common in combat zone. Psychological rationalization allowed them to continue advancing without confronting reality that instinct already signaled. Before reaching main gates, units found trains stationed on side tracks that would become iconic symbol of Dachau horror. 39 railway cars aligned on secondary tracks. Lieutenant William Cowling, aide to Brigadier General Henning Linden of 42nd Division, was among first to open car doors. What he found inside instantly destroyed any mental framework combat had built to process death. Cars contained more than 2,000 bodies of prisoners who had perished during transport from Buchenwald. But bodies was an inadequate term to describe what soldiers witnessed. They were skeletons with skin, human beings reduced to anatomies medicine would describe as terminal starvation. Muscles had been consumed by body desperate for calories. Eyes had sunk deeply into orbits. Skin stretched over bones revealed every contour of skeletal structure. Many had died in contorted positions of agony, mouths open in final silent screams. Odor was beyond any normal human experience. It wasn't simply smell of decomposition but something deeper and more disturbing. Scent of prolonged suffering mixed with death. Smell of diarrhea and dysentery that had tormented prisoners before death. Smell of typhus that raged through closed cars. Soldiers who opened first cars vomited immediately and violently. Some fell to knees, unable to remain standing. Others became completely paralyzed, staring fixedly, but unable to process what eyes transmitted to brain. Several soldiers broke psychologically on sight, began crying uncontrollably, extraordinarily rare behavior among combat-hardened troops who had witnessed violent death in battles across Europe. But horror wasn't only in what was dead. Some prisoners still lived, though barely. They were in such advanced states of starvation and disease that liberation came too late to save. Soldiers found individuals weighing 30 to 40 kilograms, half healthy body weight of adult man. Immune systems had collapsed completely. Minor wounds had become massive infections. Typhus consumed what remained of vital forces. Some were delirious with fever, murmuring incoherently in languages soldiers didn't understand. Others were conscious but beyond capacity for verbal communication, just stared with eyes that had witnessed things language couldn't articulate. Military doctors who arrived attempted to provide immediate care, but confronted brutal medical reality. When human body reaches certain stages of deterioration, reversal becomes impossible even with modern medical intervention. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks would later describe that train was moment when war ceased to be confrontation between military forces and became confrontation with evidence of evil exceeding capacity of normal human comprehension. His soldiers, veterans of amphibious landings in Sicily, combat through Italy and brutal campaign through southern France and Germany, had developed psychological tolerance for combat violence. They had seen comrades killed in explosions, burned in tanks, torn apart by artillery. But train was categorically different. It wasn't result of sudden battle violence, but evidence of prolonged, calculated suffering. It was death by design, not military necessity. And this understanding, that human beings had created systems specifically designed to cause maximum agony before death, broke something fundamental in many soldiers who witnessed. When American troops finally entered camp proper after discovering train, they passed through gates with inscription Arbeit macht frei, that would become iconic symbol of brutal Nazi hypocrisy. Inscription promised work would lead to freedom. Reality was work at Dachau led to death through exhaustion, malnutrition, and systematic physical collapse. Prisoners were forced to work 12 to 16-hour shifts daily with food rations calculated to provide calories sufficient to sustain life for approximately 3 to 6 months before cumulative malnutrition caused terminal collapse. System was designed to extract maximum labor from each prisoner before they were worn out and replaced by new arrivals. It was economy of human life as disposable resource. Inside camp, soldiers found more than 30,000 surviving prisoners in varying states of severe emaciation and disease. Many weighed less than 45 kilograms. Some were so weak they couldn't stand without assistance. Others walked but resembled walking corpses, skeletons covered in stretched skin. Prisoners' striped uniforms hung on bodies that had lost all body fat, and significant muscle mass. Eyes were sunken, faces were skulls. Many had open wounds that wouldn't heal due to compromised immune systems and complete absence of adequate nutrition. Typhus epidemic meant high fever, delirium, and severe diarrhea tormented thousands simultaneously. Sanitary conditions were catastrophic. Latrines overflowed, drinking water was contaminated, lice transmitting typhus infested all barracks. American soldiers immediately began distributing their own military rations to starving prisoners. But they confronted devastating medical tragedy. Prisoners who had been deprived of adequate food for months or years couldn't tolerate normal food. Digestive systems had atrophied. Sudden introduction of rich food caused refeeding syndrome, condition where body can't process abruptly reintroduced nutrients, resulting in cardiac failure, seizures, or multi-organ collapse. Prisoners who had survived months of starvation paradoxically died after eating food for first time in freedom. Some devoured rations so rapidly they choked. Others developed diarrhea so severe from food that resulting dehydration killed. Military doctors desperately tried to establish gradual refeeding protocols, but hundreds would die in first weeks after liberation, bodies irreversibly damaged by prolonged suffering. Soldier John Lee of 45th Division, 20 years old, wrote letter home weeks after liberation, attempting to articulate experience, transcending available vocabulary. He had killed German soldiers in combat and slept well after, understanding acts as necessary part of war between military forces. But Dachau was categorically different. There was no moral framework to process what he had witnessed. There was no military training that prepared soldiers for confrontation with evidence of system designed exclusively to maximize human suffering before death. References to crematoria where bodies were systematically burned, to gas chambers built even if not operated on industrial scale of Auschwitz, to medical experiments where prisoners were subjected to procedures violating all principles of medical ethics. Lee described that when he confronted SS guards after witnessing these things, something broke in him and comrades around him. They were no longer soldiers operating under Geneva Convention, but human beings confronting evidence of complete abandonment of humanity. Summary executions that occurred weren't premeditated murders, but primitive human reactions to evil exceeding capacity of civilized legal structures to contain. Liberated prisoners provided testimonies completing partial picture physical evidence revealed. Rabbi David Eichhorn, Jewish chaplain who arrived days after liberation, systematically documented survivor narratives. Polish prisoner who had survived 4 years at Dachau described daily selections where SS guards chose those deemed unable to work to be killed. Described punishments for minor infractions including brutal beatings, confinement in isolation cells so small prisoner couldn't sit or lie down, forced exposure to elements in Bavarian winter. Described medical experiments conducted by SS doctors where prisoners were subjected to induced hypothermia, deliberate infections, experimental drug tests, surgical procedures without anesthesia. Described how camp had internal hierarchy where some prisoners received positions of authority over others, creating system where victims were forced to participate in own oppression to survive slightly longer. In final days before liberation when SS accelerated evacuations, chaos dominated camp. Guards frantically burned documents. Prisoners considered particularly problematic witnesses were summarily executed in final hours. Feeding ceased completely in last 3 days. Hundreds died daily from starvation, typhus, or simply physical collapse. While awaiting liberation they weren't sure would arrive in time. When American soldiers finally entered on April 29th, many prisoners were in altered mental states. Some laughed hysterically, others cried uncontrollably, others sat in absolute silence unable to process that ordeal had ended. Prisoners who had sufficient strength attacked SS food depots and died from digestive overload. Others embraced American soldiers and begged confirmation that liberation was real and not typhus-induced hallucination. In subsequent days, American military forced approximately 2,000 citizens of Dachau town, located less than 1 kilometer from camp, to march through installations and witness conditions. Soldiers documented reactions in photographs and films. Many civilians claimed complete ignorance about what occurred in camp, despite crematorium chimneys operating continuously for years and smell permeating town. When confronted with physical evidence, some demonstrated genuine shock, others offered rationalization that they didn't ask questions about state affairs. Military forced civilians to participate in burials, physically confronting them with consequences of civil indifference. Well-dressed German women were photographed carrying bodies, image capturing message. Chosen ignorance didn't constitute innocence. General Eisenhower had visited smaller camp earlier in April, and been so impacted he ordered extensive documentation of all camp discoveries. Military photographers, civilian journalists, including war correspondent Margaret Higgins, and film crews meticulously documented Dachau. Thousands of photographs were taken. Hours of footage were captured. Eisenhower understood that without extensive visual documentation, future generations might question or deny reality of what had been discovered. Photographic and cinematographic evidence from Dachau became crucial in subsequent Nuremberg trials, and established precedent for documentation of crimes against humanity that would persist in future conflicts. In days and weeks following liberation, American military established field hospitals to treat survivors. Medical challenges were immense. Many prisoners suffered from tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, and severe malnutrition simultaneously. Immune systems were compromised to a point where common infections became fatal. Psychological damage was equally severe. Many survivors exhibited symptoms of profound trauma, unable to trust authority even when benevolent, struggling to accept liberation was real and not temporary. Medical teams and chaplains worked tirelessly, but confronted reality that some damage transcended capacity of medical or spiritual healing. May 1, 1945. General Frederick of 45th Division returned to Dachau 2 days after initial liberation. Camp was under American military control, but situation remained deeply chaotic. Field hospitals had been established, but thousands still required urgent medical care exceeding available capacity. Bodies were still being collected and buried, process that would take weeks. Captured SS guards awaited interrogation, while American soldiers guarding them struggled to maintain professional discipline instead of allowing justified anger to result in more summary violence. Frederick, general, hardened by months of brutal combat, faced situation without precedent in military experience. He had commanded men in bloody battles, but Dachau represented something categorically different from conventional warfare. Frederick ordered Johannes Otto, SS Vice-Commandant who had been captured trying to flee disguised as prisoner, brought for interrogation. Otto represented specific type who had operated camp system, not high-level fanatical ideologue, but mid-level bureaucrat executing administrative functions. He had common appearance, spoke educated German, presented himself with dignity of military officer. He didn't look like monster in obvious physical or behavioral sense. This superficial normality made confrontation psychologically more disturbing for Frederick. How could apparently ordinary person have participated in systems so profoundly inhuman? When Frederick demanded explanation of how human beings could create and operate installation like Dachau, Otto's response was devastating precisely in its administrative banality. He had followed superior orders as military chain of command required. Prisoners were designated as enemies of German state under prevailing laws of Reich, weren't criminals under German jurisprudence, but political categories defined by legislation. Operational procedures had been established by superior authorities based on guidelines developed in Berlin. Records were meticulously maintained according to administrative regulations. As subordinate military officer, he had executed specific functions designated by superiors. Under German law of time, no crime had been committed as actions were authorized by legal state authority. American military tribunals had no jurisdiction to judge actions executed under legal authority of sovereign nation, operating under own legal system. Frederick perceived in this moment something deeper and more disturbing than simple individual criminal culpability. Otto genuinely believed in bureaucratic legality of his actions. He demonstrated no remorse because in his mental framework, he had simply executed designated work according to established regulations. There was no personal hatred in Otto's voice, No apparent sadism, just bureaucratic tedium of officer discussing administrative procedures. This complete absence of moral recognition revealed devastating truth. Industrialized evil on Holocaust scale didn't require individual monsters, but system where thousands of people just doing jobs created destruction machine no isolated individual could construct. Frederick understood he was confronting not psychological aberration, but product of entire social system. Engineers who designed architectural efficiency of camps, chemists who developed Zyklon B for gas chambers, manufacturers who produced specialized cremation ovens, bureaucrats who processed deportation paperwork, guards who executed daily routines, doctors who conducted selections, administrators like Otto who maintained records. All were pieces of machine requiring cooperation of entire society at multiple levels. And citizens of Dachau living 1 kilometer away, who chose not to ask about smoking chimneys, were another form of complicity, passive indifference allowing evil to prosper. Frederick wrote in confidential report preserved in military archives, reflection transcending tactical or strategic questions. He had witnessed what happens when entire society accepts fundamental premise that certain human groups don't deserve to live. Dachau wasn't created by sudden impulse of collective violence, but by accumulation of small complicities, regulations defining some lives as less valuable, procedures processing people as industrial resources, civil indifference, choosing comfort of ignorance over discomfort of knowledge. SS guards who had been summarily executed by American soldiers in emotional heat of liberation violated established rules of war. But those guards were symptoms of larger social pathology, including entire structure making Dachau possible and operational for 12 years. Frederick confronted dilemma without satisfactory resolution. He didn't know if summary executions that had occurred were justifiable under any consistent ethical framework universally applicable. Soldiers who executed SS guards acted impulsively under impact of psychological trauma caused by witnessing evidence. But if civilized society permitted emotional shock to justify extrajudicial violence, then very principles distinguishing allies from Nazis would erode. However, requiring soldiers who had just discovered evidence of crimes against humanity to maintain perfect professional composure seemed to ask something beyond normal human capacity. After witnessing Dachau, absolute concepts of right and wrong had collapsed under weight of reality, transcending moral frameworks developed to handle conventional conflicts between civilized nations operating under shared rules. Final statistics were precise in documentation but inadequate to capture human magnitude. Liberation occurred April 29, 1945 by combined forces of 42nd Rainbow Division, 45th Thunderbird Division, and 20th Armored Division. More than 32,000 prisoners were liberated in main camp. Train containing approximately 2,300 bodies was discovered before entrance to camp. Official records documented at least 41,500 deaths at Dachau between 1933 and 1945. Number certainly understated considering destroyed records and chaotic final period. More than 7,000 prisoners had been forced on death marches days before liberation. More than 2,000 prisoners died in first weeks after liberation despite medical care. Bodies irreversibly damaged. Estimates vary regarding number of SS guards summarily executed during liberation, ranging from 35 to 50. Acts later investigated but largely didn't result in punishments due to extraordinary circumstances. Brigadier General Felix Sparks, who commanded 157th Infantry Regiment of 45th Division during liberation, declared in later testimony, "Dachau was like entering physical manifestation of hell. No words in English language were adequate to describe deliberate cruelty and calculated coldness they had witnessed. He had participated in bloody battles through multiple campaigns, but nothing prepared him for Dachau. It was day he learned true evil doesn't require fanatical individual hatred, but just organized indifference of many executing bureaucratic functions without questioning broader moral purpose of system they served." Lieutenant William Walsh provided devastating testimony to American Congress. They had found train first before entering camp proper. When they opened cars, experienced combat-hardened soldiers broke psychologically. Some cried openly, rare behavior among combat troops. Others vomited violently. Some fell into absolute silence and never were completely sane psychologically. When they arrived at camp hours later and confronted SS guards, something fundamental broke at collective level. They were no longer soldiers operating under established rules of war. They were human beings confronting evidence of systematized inhumanity, transcending conventional frameworks of military conflict. Executions that happened weren't calculated murders, but primitive human responses to evil exceeding capacity of language to articulate or legal structures to categorize. Dachau's legacy transcended specific liberation to establish fundamental precedents. It definitively proved witnessing certain horrors has psychological limit, beyond which professional composure collapses even among most disciplined troops. Reprisals occurring during liberation forced moral and legal questions persisting. When confronted with evidence of crimes against humanity, should military forces strictly maintain established prisoner treatment protocols? Summary executions were never officially sanctioned, but investigations resulted in minimal punishments. Implicit recognition that extraordinary circumstances produce responses transcending standardized operational procedures. Dachau also exposed civil complicity through chosen indifference. Entire town living less than 1 kilometer from camp, claiming complete ignorance despite chimneys operating continuously for years. When citizens were forced to confront physical evidence and participate in burials, claims of ignorance were revealed as active choices not to see, not to ask, not to recognize obvious reality. This revelation profoundly influenced concepts of collective responsibility emerging in Nuremberg trials. Tribunal would establish following orders: didn't constitute adequate defense for crimes against humanity. Civil indifference was recognized as form of complicity, allowing evil to prosper. System of industrialized destruction required participation of entire society through multiple forms of cooperation, from active fanaticism to convenient passivity. Extensive photographs and footage from Dachau became central Holocaust evidence presented at Nuremberg. Eisenhower had prophetically understood that without massive visual documentation, future generations might question or deny reality. Thousands of photographs and hours of footage preserved evidence transcending possibility of denial. These images guaranteed world couldn't claim ignorance about nature of Nazi regime or reality of Holocaust. They established precedent for atrocity documentation, influencing future conflict coverage and development of international human rights. Lesson endured beyond specific World War II context. Dachau demonstrated systematized evil doesn't require individual monsters, but social systems, where many execute specific functions without assuming moral responsibility for collective result. It revealed civilized societies can slide into barbarism through accumulation of small complicities instead of sudden transformation. And it forced confrontation with question without satisfactory answer. Where is limit of civilized tolerance when confronted with evidence of complete abandonment of humanity by others? This question remains relevant to contemporary moral dilemmas about intervention, justice, and limits of principles when confronted with extreme violations.